What Rome did to captured queens was worse than death. The logic of the cage. When you stand on the Capitoline Hill today, looking down over the ruins of the Forum, you see marble dust and quiet. The noise is gone. But you have to listen harder. Underneath the sound of tourists and traffic, there is a specific vibration that the stones remember, the sound of iron rings scraping against the neck of a woman who used to be a god. Rome didn't kill queens. Not usually, not at first. That would have been a waste of a perfectly good narrative. Killing a queen in the heat of battle was an accident of war. Killing a queen in a dungeon was a footnote. Rome understood narrative better than any Hollywood studio ever could. They understood that the end of a story is less important than the journey of the fall. And they had perfected an art form specifically for this fall. It was called the triumph. To understand what happened to Boudicca's daughters, to Zenobia, to Arsinoe, and to Vercingetorix's female kin, you have to understand what the triumph was. It wasn't just a parade. It was a religious cleansing ritual and a psychological weapon fused into one. The Roman word triumphus comes from an older Etruscan root linked to the god Dionysus, a god of tearing things apart. And that is exactly what they did. They tore the soul apart. Imagine you are Cleopatra Selene II. You are not the famous one, that was your mother. But you are the daughter of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony. You are 11 years old. You have lived in a palace where the walls were made of alabaster and the floors were gold leaf. You were addressed as Basilissa, Queen. You were divine. Then the Roman Octavian, who we call Augustus, catches you. Your mother is dead by her own hand. Your father is dead by his own sword. And you are alive. They don't beat you in the cell. The food is actually quite good. The guards speak in hushed tones, not out of respect for you, but out of respect for the prop. You are a prop. You are the most expensive, most delicate, most breakable prop in the history of the world. They wash you. They dress you. They give you a specific tunic. They are preparing you for your scene. And this is the first layer of the horror, the anticipation. The days in the Tullianum, the state prison, were days spent listening to the crowd build the scaffolding for your soul's execution. You can hear the hammers. You can smell the sawdust. You can hear the lions that will eat the gladiators, and you wonder if they will eat you. They won't. You are too valuable for the beasts. You are saved for the moment. The morning of the triumph, they come for you. The light hurts your eyes. They don't blindfold you. They want you to see. They clamp a golden chain around your neck. Gold. Not iron. Iron is for the common barbarian. Gold is for you, because it gleams in the sun and shows the mob that even her wealth is now our collar. You are placed in a cart or, if you are unlucky and strong like the Gallic women, you are made to walk. But walking is hard because your legs are trembling. The noise is not like a stadium concert. It is an animal roar. 200,000 people lining the Via Sacra. They have been drinking since dawn. They have been given free grain. They are here to see you break. As you emerge into the Forum, you see him. The triumphator. The general. His face is painted red like the statue of Jupiter Capitolinus. That red paint is cinnabar, a toxic mercury ore. He is literally a god for a day, and he is killing himself slowly with the paint just to look like a god. And you? You are the proof of his godhood. You walk behind him. You are the inverse of his glory. For every step he takes toward the temple of Jupiter, you take a step toward the Tullianum. That's the secret route. The parade goes up the hill, but at a certain point, at the casa, the prison steps, the cart stop. The shouting stops for just a breath. It is a ritual silence. The general turns, the red paint cracking around his eyes, and he gives a nod. The nod is the signal. This is the moment Vercingetorix died. This is the moment Jugurtha died. And this is the moment the captured queens and princesses learned what was worse than death, strangulation in public darkness. They don't do it in the street. They don't want the blood on the cobblestones to stain the general's divine moment. They drag you, or in the case of a queen, they might escort you with a firm grip on the gold chain, down a flight of steps into the Tullianum. It's a hole. A round, dank, wet hole under the street. The crowd outside is still cheering, but down here, the sound is muffled. It sounds like a seashell held to your ear, but the ocean is made of screams. The executioner is not a soldier. He is a speculator, a specialist. He doesn't use a sword. Swords are for honorable deaths. He uses a rope or a twisted cloth. They loop it around your neck. The last thing you see is the flickering light of an oil lamp reflecting off the wet stone walls of the cell that held St. Peter. The last thing you hear is not the crowd chanting your name. They never chanted your name. They chanted the general's name. You are the negative space in the photograph of Roman glory. Then your body is dragged out. Not thrown to the dogs. That would be too disrespectful to the gods of the triumph. The body is buried or disposed of quietly. And the general? He goes up the hill to the temple of Jupiter and lays down his laurel wreath on the lap of the statue. The god is pleased. The balance of the universe is restored. A queen has been unmade. And Rome feels safer. But that is just the end of the process. The worse than death part is the journey to that rope. And for many women, that journey took years, decades. It took the form of something called the Domus Caesaris, the house of Caesar, which was less a home and more of a gilded terrarium for conquered royalty. The terrarium of the Caesars, the long humiliation. Let's leave the dark hole of the Tullianum. Let's walk up the Palatine Hill. The air smells of roses and grilled fish. This is the imperial palace. And if you were a captured queen of high enough value, usually one with blood ties to Alexander the Great or the pharaohs, you didn't go to the Tullianum. You were adopted. This was a fate that lasted not minutes, but a lifetime. And it was a specific kind of psychological destruction. Take Zenobia, the Queen of Palmyra. She is one of the few we know by name who survived the physical walk, though the accounts differ on whether she was strangled or not. The most credible narrative says she was led in the triumph of Aurelian in 274 AD. She walked. But she was weighed down by so much jewelry, her own emeralds and pearls, that she could barely move. The Romans made her wear the entire contents of her treasury. They hung gold chains so thick on her neck that attendants had to hold them up so she wouldn't collapse. It was a visual joke. Look at the queen. Her wealth is her prison. She is crushed by her own vanity. The crowd didn't see a warrior queen who nearly beat Rome. They saw a woman staggering under the weight of a chandelier. That's the Roman genius, turning a military threat into a fashion victim. If Aurelian spared her life and the Historia Augusta, while unreliable, suggests he gave her a villa in Tiber, that was worse. Why? Because living as a guest of the Roman state was a daily execution of the self. You wake up every morning in a beautiful villa in Tivoli. You have slaves. You have food. But you are surrounded by the children of the men who killed your husband. You have to smile at dinner parties where the senator next to you boasts about the pacification of your homeland. Your daughters are married off to Roman equestrians, not as an honor, but to dilute your bloodline, to make sure no child of your line ever thinks of reclaiming a throne. You are a living museum exhibit. Every year, on the anniversary of the triumph, a minor official might visit you, not to check on your health, but to ensure you are still there, still a visible testament to Roman mercy. And the worst part? You have to be grateful. You have to write letters thanking the emperor for his clemency. Failure to show gratitude was a sign of continued rebellion and a one-way ticket back to the Tullianum. Consider Arsinoe IV of Egypt, the half-sister of Cleopatra. She was paraded through Alexandria by Julius Caesar, not even in Rome proper, but in a provincial mock triumph. She was in chains. The crowd in Alexandria was Greek and Egyptian. They knew her. They knew she was a Ptolemy, a goddess. Seeing her in chains, sweating, her royal diadem replaced with a rope of rushes, was so offensive to the local population that Caesar had to cut the parade short because the crowd was about to riot. Caesar, the master propagandist, miscalculated. He thought the Egyptians would enjoy seeing a Ptolemy humbled. Instead, they saw a sacred vessel defiled. So what did Caesar do? He didn't kill her right away. He sent her to Ephesus to live in the temple of Artemis. She was a hostage, a pawn. She lived there for years, a forgotten queen in a city of marble. But she was never forgotten by Cleopatra. Years later, when Mark Antony and Cleopatra ruled the East, they had her dragged from the steps of that temple and executed. Even in exile, even in a sanctuary, the queen was a threat that had to be erased. Rome's long shadow found her. But the most devastating form of this long humiliation was reserved for the children. Specifically, the daughters. This is where the script of Roman cruelty reads like a psychological horror novel. The inheritance of shame, Cleopatra Selene and the daughters of defeat. Let's go back to that 11-year-old girl, Cleopatra Selene. She walked in the triumph of Augustus in 29 BC. She didn't walk alone. Her twin brother, Alexander Aelios, walked beside her. They were dressed as the sun and the moon. Augustus had forced them to wear elaborate costumes representing their own divine names. Imagine being a child, wearing a heavy golden sun crown that keeps slipping over your eyes, and every time you push it up, you see a Roman plebeian laughing at you. You are the sun. And the sun is crying. That image, the crying sun, was the greatest piece of propaganda Augustus ever created. After the parade, the executioner's rope did not come for them. Augustus was too smart for that. Killing a child queen in cold blood would have made him look like a monster. Instead, he did something far more effective. He gave them to his sister, Octavia. Octavia was the good Roman woman. She was the anti-Cleopatra. She was pious, modest, and she wove her own wool. She had been Mark Antony's wife before he left her for Cleopatra. Now, she was raising Cleopatra's children. The narrative writes itself. The virtuous Roman matron civilizes the barbarian offspring of the Eastern whore. Every single day in that house was a lesson in shame. Selene learned Latin. She learned to spin wool. She learned to call Octavia mother. She learned that her real mother was a monster who had corrupted Mark Antony and nearly destroyed Rome. The history she was taught was the history of her family's disgrace. Augustus kept her alive because she was a bargaining chip. There was a kingdom in North Africa called Mauritania. It needed a king. But Rome didn't want to send a Roman. Too risky. So they sent the last Ptolemy. They married Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of the woman who almost owned the Mediterranean, to Juba II, a Numidian prince who had also been raised as a hostage in Rome. Two orphans of empire, married to each other, sent to rule a client kingdom on the edge of the Sahara. It sounds like a happy ending. It wasn't. It was exile in gilded chains. Every coin she minted in Mauritania had to feature the face of Augustus on the front. Her own face was on the back, smaller. Every decision Juba made had to be approved by a Roman procurator. She built a library in Caesarea, modern Churchill, Algeria that rivaled Alexandria. She filled it with scrolls. She tried to recreate the Mausian of her mother. And the Romans let her. They wanted her to do it. Because as long as she was playing librarian on the edge of the desert, she wasn't building a navy to reclaim Egypt. They allowed her the illusion of power to drain the reality of it. And the final, exquisite twist of the knife? Her son was named Ptolemy. He was the last male Ptolemy. He was the grandson of Cleopatra and Antony. He was the heir to a dynasty that stretched back to Alexander's general. And in 40 AD, Emperor Caligula, who was a madman but also a keen student of dynastic threat, invited young Ptolemy of Mauritania to Rome. Ptolemy came wearing a purple cloak, the royal color. Caligula saw it. He saw the bloodline. He saw the threat. And Caligula had him murdered. Cleopatra Selene was likely dead by then, spared the news of her son's execution. But her line ended in a puddle of blood on the Palatine Hill, exactly where it was always supposed to end. It just took 50 years longer. 50 years of being a queen of a kingdom that was really a Roman ranch. That is a death of the spirit that no sword can match. But what about the queens who weren't Greek? What about the ones who didn't speak Latin or understand the subtle games of the Palatine? What about the Celtic and Germanic women? For them, Rome reserved a different kind of horror, one that was less about diplomacy and more about pure, unadulterated physical and psychological obliteration. The wicker cords and the iron Boudicca's daughters and the fury of the north. There is a story that Tacitus tells. It's a story that, once you read it, you cannot unread it. It explains why Boudicca burned London to the ground. It explains why they cut the throats of Roman women and hung them up as offerings to Andraste, the goddess of victory. It was not just about taxes. It was about what Rome did to her daughters. Boudicca was queen of the Iceni. Her husband, Prasutagus, had made a deal with Rome. He would leave half his kingdom to the Emperor Nero, and half to his two daughters. He thought this was clever. He thought Rome would honor the will. He didn't understand Rome. The moment Prasutagus died, the Roman procurator, Catus Decianus, arrived with his soldiers and his debt collectors. They didn't come to negotiate. They came to annex. They decided that half the kingdom actually meant all of it. They decided that the king's will was irrelevant because women couldn't rule barbarian lands. They went to the royal hall. Boudicca stood in front of her throne. She was a tall woman with a menere of red hair and a voice like a war horn. She told them to leave. They didn't leave. They flogged her. In the middle of her own hall. They stripped her of her royal robes and beat her with rods. The Roman rods, the fasces, the symbol of Roman authority. They broke the skin on her back. But that was just the beginning. They took her daughters, the princesses, the virgins, and the Roman soldiers raped them. Repeatedly, publicly. Tacitus, who was no friend of the Britons, writes it with a clinical coldness that makes it even worse. The kingdom was plundered by centurions, the house by slaves, as if they were spoils of war. And then, his wife Boudicca was scourged, and his daughters outraged. That word. Outraged. Stuprum. It is a word that covers a multitude of sins, but in Roman law, it meant the violation of a woman's chastity. For a Celtic royal family, chastity was sacred. The daughters of the king were not just people, they were vessels of the tribe's luck, the tribe's future. To defile them was not just to hurt a girl, it was to break the spiritual spine of the Iceni nation. The Romans knew this. They didn't do it because they were out of control. They did it because it was policy. It was a message to the entire island: we can enter the house of your queen. We can beat her like a common slave. We can take the heirs to your gods and use them as we would use a whore in the Subura. There is no sacred space we cannot reach. There is no honor we cannot erase. What happened to those girls after the revolt? We don't know. Tacitus doesn't tell us. Did they die in the final battle, crushed in the wagon circle? Did they take their own lives with poison rather than face capture again? Did they survive, only to be dragged back to Rome for the mercy of the cage? Their names are lost. Boudicca's name we remember because of the fire she set. But her daughters' names are ash. Rome succeeded in one thing. They turned the princesses into a blank space in history. They weren't just killed. They were UN-written. Their existence is only a footnote in the cause of a rebellion. That is a fate worse than death. to be remembered only for the pain inflicted upon you, not for who you were before the soldiers came through the door. This pattern repeated itself in Germany. After the disaster of Teutoburg Forest, where Arminius wiped out 3 legions, Rome was terrified of the north. But they still launched punitive expeditions. Germanicus Caesar went in to restore honor. He didn't just fight warriors. He targeted the Cirrhuses, the Veleda figures, the holy women. Tacitus describes a scene of desolation. The Romans came upon a grove sacred to the goddess Tanfana. The pillars were drenched in the blood of men. The Romans destroyed the temple. And they captured the priestesses. These women were old, or young, or mothers. They were not soldiers. But they were the voices of the gods. Rome understood that to conquer a people, you had to silence the voices that spoke to their sky. What did they do to these captured holy women of the north? We have fragments of evidence. The Romans were fascinated by the Germanic custom of drowning captives in bogs. But Rome had its own bog. It was the Velabrum, the low-lying district near the Forum. Or it was the slave markets behind the Temple of Castor. If a captured priestess was brought to Rome, she was stripped of her herbs and her amber beads. She was sold. Or she was given to a temple, not her own temple, but a Roman temple, to be a serva publica, a public slave. She would sweep the steps of the Temple of Saturn while the citizens who worshipped there walked past her, not seeing her, not knowing that the woman sweeping the dust had once communed with the thunder in the forests of the north. She would live for 30 years, maybe 40, forgotten. Her gods were silent in the Roman stone. She was a ghost walking on paved roads where the earth could not breathe. The silence, the concrete, that was the Roman version of a bog. It swallowed the soul whole. The Parthians shot the gender of shame. Rome did not have a monopoly on cruelty, but they had a monopoly on spectacle. And when it came to dealing with female rulers of the East, the Parthians and later the Sassanids, the humiliation was often filtered through a lens of sexual and gendered mockery that was specifically Roman. Consider the fate of the women captured from the camp of King Decebalus of Dacia. Trajan's column shows the scene. The Dacian nobles are poisoning themselves, the men are fighting to the death, but the women? They are being herded like cattle. We see them in their long tunics, hair disheveled, being led away by Roman auxiliaries. One panel shows a Roman soldier grabbing a Dacian woman by the hair. It's a small detail in a swirl of marble, but it's the key to the whole war. Trajan didn't just want Dacia's gold mines. He wanted to show the people back home that the wild women of the mountains were now their chambermaids. But the most jarring example of this worse-than-death psychology involves the Severan dynasty and the Parthian princesses. When Emperor Septimius Severus captured the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, he didn't just sack the treasury. He took the royal harem. These were the daughters of the King of Kings, the Arsacid dynasty. They were veiled. They were untouchable. Their very existence was a secret to all but the closest eunuchs. Severus brought them out into the sunlight. He made them walk in the open air where thousands of legionaries could stare at them. For a Parthian noblewoman, this was a violation of the highest order, a metaphysical rape of their honor. Severus's son, the mad Emperor Caracalla, took this a step further. He proposed to marry the daughter of the Parthian king Artabanus. The king, knowing Roman treachery, refused. Caracalla feigned peace. He invited the king and the Parthian nobles to a wedding feast on the plains. The Parthians came, unarmed, wearing their finest silks and flowers in their hair. It was a trap. Caracalla gave a signal. The Roman soldiers drew their hidden swords and butchered the Parthian nobles. Artabanus only escaped because he was thrown on a horse by his bodyguards and fled. But the women of the court? The daughters and wives who had come to celebrate a wedding? They were captured. Caracalla stripped them of their jewels and their robes. He gave the robes to his soldiers as souvenirs. He treated the Parthian princesses exactly as he would treat the loot from a temple. He didn't kill them quickly. He distributed them among the camp followers and the baggage train. They were royalty. They were divine. And they ended their days washing tunics for the men who had murdered their fathers and brothers, in a language they did not speak, under a sun that was not their own. A Parthian historian, if one had survived the Sassanid purge, would have written, "They did not die. They became Romans," which is the same thing as being unmade. The erasure of identity is the ultimate death for a royal. And Rome was a machine designed to erase the identity of anyone who was not Rome. The psychological inversion why the mercy was crueler. We have to talk about the mercy, the clementia Caesaris. It was a virtue that every emperor boasted about on his coins. Clemency. But for a captured queen, clemency was the long way down the stairs. It was the slow drip of acid on the soul. Let's compare two fates. Fate A, the Celtic queen Cartimandua. She was a Roman ally. She betrayed Caratacus. She was a client queen. She ruled the brigands. But her own people hated her for her Roman ways and her divorce from her husband. She was eventually overthrown and had to be rescued by Roman cavalry. She fled south. She lived out her days in a Roman villa, safe, protected by the legions. She was alive. She was free. But she had lost her imperium. She had lost the acclamation of her tribe. She sat in a Roman garden listening to the birds, knowing that up north, the people she was born to rule were cursing her name. Was she grateful for the rescue? Or did she wake up every morning in that quiet villa, smelling the imported roses, and feel the ghost weight of the talk that used to be around her neck? The talk was gone. The Roman necklace, the metaphorical golden chain, was in its place. She was a queen without a people. A voice without a language. A tree without soil. She lived. And living was the punishment. Fate B, Boudica. She lost. She took poison allegedly. She died free in a sense, surrounded by the smoke of a burning province. Her body was never found, never paraded, never shackled in the Tullianum. Which one of them got the better deal? The one who died in the fire or the one who lived in the marble garden? Rome understood that for a woman of power, especially a barbarian queen, the loss of status was more psychologically devastating than the loss of breath. They had a term for it, captivitas. It didn't just mean captivity. It meant the state of being a prize. The Roman poet Ovid, exiled to the Black Sea, wrote about the captive women he saw in the triumphs of his youth. He describes a German woman looking at the painted walls of Rome with wild, uncomprehending eyes. He calls her a trophy. He doesn't ask her name. He doesn't wonder if she had children. She is a piece of furniture in the room of Roman memory. And this is the ultimate, final, most dreadful part of the story. The naming. In Rome, you had 3 names. It was a mark of a citizen. A captured queen had her name stripped. She was referred to by her tribe. The Iceni woman. The Dacian princess. The Egyptian. Cleopatra Selene was allowed to keep her name because her name was a weapon of mockery. Selene, the moon, walking behind the son of Augustus. But for most, the name died. Boudica's daughters? We don't know their names. They are just the outraged girls. The Parthian princesses in Caracalla's camp? Just the concubines. To be unnamed is to be unremembered. To be unremembered is to never have existed. Rome didn't just kill queens. They performed an damnatio memoriae on their womanhood while they were still breathing. They turned them into adjectives. They made them Roman property. There is a story, possibly apocryphal but perfectly Roman in spirit, about a Gallic chieftain's wife captured after Alesia. She was brought to Caesar's tent. The centurion announced her, the woman of the Arverni. She looked at Caesar, who was sitting at his desk, writing his commentaries. And she said, and this is the voice of defiance in the dark, I am not the woman of the Arverni. I am the wife of the king of the Arverni. Caesar, without looking up from his parchment, dipped his reed pen in the inkwell and replied, the king is dead. The Arverni are a province. You are in my tent. Therefore, you are whatever I write you to be. And he wrote her into his book as captor, a captured thing. And that was that. She lived for another 20 years, a laundress or a weaver or a nurse to a Roman brat. But on the page, in the history that we still read today, she is dead. She is a single word. And the silence of that word is heavier than any stone in the Tullianum. The archaeology of suffering what the bones tell us. History isn't just written in ink. It's written in calcium and soil. In recent years, archaeology in the UK and Germany has uncovered the kind of evidence that the literary sources gloss over. The mass graves. The deviant burials. In York, they found the skeleton of a woman from the Roman period. She was buried face down in a shallow grave. Her arms were crossed behind her back. There was an iron shackle around her ankle. She was young, perhaps 20. Her teeth showed severe enamel hyperplasia, a sign of extreme malnutrition or stress in childhood. But here's the detail that makes the archaeologist pause. The isotope analysis of her teeth showed she wasn't from Britain. She was from the Alps region. Possibly Noricum. She was a captive, moved across the empire, and dumped in the mud of a northern fortress. Who was she? Was she the daughter of a chieftain who resisted the Roman annexation of the Alps? Was she brought to Britain to serve as a slave in the household of the governor? We don't know. But her burial was an act of contempt. Face down. The Romans believed that the soul escaped through the mouth. By burying her face down, her soul was forced down into the earth, into the realm of the infernal gods, forever. She could never find her way home to the mountain passes of her childhood. Even in death, Rome controlled the direction of her ghost. In the bogs of northern Germany, they found the body of a girl, about 16. This was not a Roman burial, this was a Germanic ritual. But the context is everything. She was found near Calcrease, the likely site of the Teutoburg forest battle. The Germanic tribes celebrated their victory over Varus by sacrificing captured Roman officers and, according to Tacitus, their own traitors. But the bogs also hold women. Young women. Were they Roman camp followers? Or were they Germanic Syrices who had warned of the Roman advance and were now being punished by their own people for being unclean or Roman-touched? The intersection of Roman conquest and local superstition created a no-man's land for women. They were damned if they resisted Rome, they'd be paraded in chains, and damned if they collaborated with Rome, they'd end up in the bog with a cord around their neck and a branch pinning their arm down. The silence of the bog bodies is the loudest sound in this story. The bog preserves skin, hair, and fingerprints. It preserves the face of a person who lived 2,000 years ago. But it does not preserve the why. Why this girl? Why this drowning? The answer is in the Roman camp just over the hill. The presence of the eagle changed everything. It poisoned the wells of tribal law. It made every daughter suspect. The survivor's script when freedom was a cage. Let's talk about one more name. One more queen who lived. Chaito. Or perhaps she didn't. Chaito was the wife of the Gallic usurper Tetricus. In the chaotic 3rd century, Tetricus ruled the Gallic Empire, a breakaway state from Rome. He was a senator. He was Roman. But he was a rebel. When Emperor Aurelian finally came to crush him, Tetricus did something both cowardly and brilliant. He surrendered in secret. He wrote Aurelian a note, "Save me, invincible one, from these troubles." Aurelian accepted his surrender. Tetricus was brought to Rome for the triumph. But he wasn't in chains. He wore trousers, Gallic trousers, which the Romans found hilarious. He was a joke. Aurelian made him a governor of a province in Italy. He lived. But what of his wife, Chaito? The sources are whisper thin. She was likely in the triumph too. She walked. She was a Gallic empress. Was she strangled? The records don't say. But we know Tetricus lived out his days as a Roman administrator. Did she live with him? A wife, living in a villa, knowing her husband had traded her dignity and the lives of his soldiers for a pair of trousers and a joke at the emperor's dinner table? If she lived in the shadow of that betrayal. She was the queen of a fallen kingdom that was never really a kingdom. She was a Roman matron now, but her neighbors would always whisper, "There goes the woman who was almost an empress. Look how plain her dress is now." This is the natural script you asked for. It's not a drama with swords and shouting. It's the quiet, crushing weight of a Tuesday afternoon in a Roman suburb 20 years after the war. You are Chaito. You are at the market. You buy a fish. You haggle over the price of olives. The fishmonger calls you Domina. He doesn't know you once had slaves who did this for you. You walk home. You pass a wall with graffiti. It's a crude drawing of a man in trousers with a caption, "Tetricus the Turncoat." You look away. You go inside. You close the door. You are safe. You are fed. You are alive. And you are absolutely, irrevocably, dead inside. Because the worst thing Rome did to captured queens was to let them live long enough to understand exactly what they had lost. The eternal afternoon, the logic of the long defeat. We circle back to the beginning. The Tullianum. The rope. The gold chain. That was the fast way. For the highest profile, most dangerous enemies, the Jugurthas and Vercingetorixes, the death was quick, dark, and quiet. It was a mercy disguised as an execution. But for the women, the calculus was different. A dead queen is a martyr. A dead queen is a story the bards sing about for 1,000 years. Boudica is immortal because she died in fire and rebellion. But Cleopatra Selene? She died in bed, in Mauritania, surrounded by Roman art. She is a footnote in the history of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. She is the one who didn't die in the triumph. Rome understood optics better than we do. They knew that a woman living in a nice house with a nice husband, raising children who speak Latin, is a much better advertisement for Roman peace than a corpse swinging from a rope. The living queen was proof that even the wildest heart could be tamed. The living queen was a living lie. She stood in the atrium of the Roman house, and her very presence said, "See? Even I have accepted it. Even I am Roman now." And the Roman crowd, eating their free bread and watching the chariots race, would look at her and think, "Good. One less thing to worry about." But deep inside that atrium, when the lamps were low and the Roman husband was asleep, the queen would sit by the window. She would look up at the moon, the same moon she used to worship under a different name, in a different tongue. She would trace the scars on her wrists where the gold chains used to be. And she would realize that she had been given the heaviest, most invisible chain of all, memory. Memory of the palace. Memory of the power. Memory of the before. And that memory was a weight that pressed down on her chest every single day until her heart stopped. She was not a prisoner of Rome. She was a prisoner of her own past, curated and displayed by Rome for the rest of her natural life. That is what Rome did to captured queens. They didn't just take their freedom. They took their narrative. They rewrote the ending. And they made sure the queen had to live inside that rewritten, Romanized, sanitized, humiliating ending until the ink dried on her obituary, an obituary written not in her own language, but in the cold, efficient, imperial Latin of the victors. And the world moved on. The stones of the Forum grew quiet. The tourist looks at the Arch of Titus, sees the menorah being carried away, and thinks of the gold. They rarely think of the women. The women who walked behind the gold. The women whose names are the space between the letters on the architrave. The silence in the stone. That silence is the sound of what Rome did. It is a silence louder than a scream. And it has lasted for 2,000 years.